the topic of the talk is going to be deliberate practice, specifically deliberate practice in psychotherapy training and education. And it's something that I know a lot of people have never heard of. So I just want to throw out a question. Has anybody even heard of this before? And if so, what are you aware of?
I've heard of it, but I've never used it. But my understanding is it's kind of like fake therapy where you go and you can practice your skills in a way that there's no consequences if you make mistakes or anything like that. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Cassie. I think that's a really good description. And not only no consequences if you make mistakes, the expectation is that you will make mistakes because therapy is hard. And these specific skills that we all use in therapy are difficult. And so just like learning any other skill that may be challenging, the built-in assumption is that you will try and it may not go perfectly, and then you try again and you try again, and eventually it becomes more like second nature. And so that is what the focus of this hour is going to be. So I'm going to pull up my slides here. Here we go. So as Alex had mentioned, there we go. Yes, I'm an AMFT. I actually graduated with my master's a year and a half ago. And I think it's probably fair to say that I frustrated a lot of my professors in grad school because fairly early on, I came across a lot of research that called into question that we even know, like at the most basic level, how therapy works. This is an article that some of you may have read, co-authored by none other than the esteemed Alex Williams, about how the empirically supported treatments that we all know and love, it's hard to say with certainty that they are why therapy is effective. Similarly, there's a lot of research that calls into question what makes therapists get more effective over time, if that even happens. And so I was learning a lot about this just kind of curiously on my own. And I would ask my professors questions that I don't think they wanted me to ask. At one point I was called insubordinate, which is probably fair. And so I found a healthier way to express my curiosity about the field and the uncertainty at the core of what is it that we all do as therapists. So part of that was, as Alex mentioned, starting this podcast with a good friend of mine, where we talk to clients of therapy who have had really bad experiences, because we all learn how to do therapy well. We're taught what it looks like to do good therapy, but a significant percentage of clients don't actually get better, and a smaller percentage actually get worse in therapy. And so I was curious what happens when things don't work out. That led me to this idea of deliberate practice. And much like Cassie had said, it's a way to practice specific skills without the consequences of failure if you're working directly with clients, for example. I wanted to know, are there reliable ways that therapists can improve over time? Because I think that's a big question in our field. And so that led me to some of the people who have begun implementing this idea of deliberate practice in our field specifically. The idea of deliberate practice was formalized about 30 years ago, and it's made significant advances in medicine, in athletics, and music, but it's only now beginning to emerge in our field. And so I'm very excited and privileged to be a part of that as the COO of this university and as the director of the counseling center, where deliberate practice is something that is infused in everything we do. So half of every class involves deliberate practice, training and supervision incorporates deliberate practice. And the reason why nobody's heard of us and we don't exist yet formally is because we're awaiting approval from the state of California to actually be a degree granting institution, which will likely happen in January. And then hopefully our name will get out there as we try something new. We can't guarantee that it's going to be the next wave of how therapists are trained and educated, but we feel that it is certainly worth trying. And why it's worth trying, I'll get into more in a moment. But first, I would actually like to invite you all to practice, to try something real quick. And it looks like everybody's got their mics muted, which is good, because I'm not going to have you all respond. This is a 25-second video clip. So nobody can hear you except yourself, maybe a cat or a dog in the background. But this is a skill this is an exercise from a skill designed to improve your ability to convey empathy, to respond in a way that is empathic to clients. And this is one of an infinite number of skills that can be practiced using this idea of deliberate practice, right? You can practice skills related to very specific models of therapy. You can practice things like telling a client that you have to make a report to Child Protective Services. You can practice anything to help have it be more second nature. But this is just specifically the basic skill of communicating empathy to a client. And so what I'm going to do is play this video clip. And what I'd like each of you to do with your mics muted is, after the clip is done, just say out loud, as if this was a session that you were in, just improvise a response that meets these two skill criteria as best as you can. So it reflects back their underlying internal experience in different language and in a tone that's tentative and exploratory. And then after it looks like everybody's done, I'm actually going to respond out loud myself and do a terrible job. And we're going to talk about what exactly I did that missed the skill criteria. So I will go ahead and play this now. Let me just double check that I'm sharing for audio. Wonderful. All right.
My previous therapist asked me a lot about my feelings, and to me, it never really helped. You know, I remember one time getting so upset that she actually had to call an ambulance and I had to go to the hospital. So if it's okay with you, I would rather not talk about my feelings.
And so now just take a moment and improvise a response based on these skill criteria. And so it looks like nobody is still talking to themselves. You may have come up with one in your mind, which is also great. And so here's a response that I might give to this client would be, yeah, I understand, but at the same time, the core of therapy is talking about your feelings. And so that's actually what we're going to do. Even if it's really hard, it's important that in this moment, what you're doing is paying attention to and talking to your feelings. And so now I want to check in with anybody who has a response. How do you feel like my response mapped onto these skill criteria? And is there anything specific that it seems like I missed?
You didn't really reflect back their experience. You kind of just dismissed their experience.
Yeah, and I'm sure we've all experienced conversations like this, and they aren't usually helpful, let alone therapeutic anyway. So thank you, Haley. Exactly. And so how this idea of deliberate practice works is, if we're using a video prompt, for example, I may have a coach, a supervisor, a peer, somebody who has a good grasp of the skill of empathic understanding, do exactly what you just did, Haley, is let me know what it is that I missed. And then I would just watch the clip and do it again and keep practicing until it felt like my response was adequately meeting the skill criteria. And it felt a bit more second nature than having to sit and think, maybe give a response that isn't helpful or do it in a way that's choppy. It's repetition. It's practicing like you're learning any other skill. This is one of an infinite number of skills that you could practice, one of an infinite number of client statements that you could hear. This is just one example of what deliberate practice can look like. So with that in mind, let's talk about why this may be important, what exactly it is, what the research suggests about deliberate practice. And a good place to start here is a question that I don't think a lot of us really want to ask, but is probably important for us as a field to consider, which is, do we as therapists improve over time? And the rather sobering answer to that, this is not unique to therapists, by the way, is not reliably. So some therapists improve over time, others actually decline over time and their outcomes get worse. But in aggregate, overall, therapists don't really get better over time. And the graph on top here in the upper right comes from the first longitudinal study to measure therapist outcomes. And they looked at therapists over up to 18 years of practice. And what they found was about 60% actually declined and about 40% improved. And on average, it was a slight downward slope. And this is very concerning and confusing, and I think humbling in a lot of ways, because the expectation is, we go to school, we get supervision, we get better with experience, we go to workshops, and we get better as therapists. But that actually does not appear to be the case reliably. And so I have a colleague, his name is Darryl Chow, and he likes to describe this as the question between, are we getting, say, 20 years of experience, or are we getting our first year of experience and repeating it 20 times? And again, this isn't something that only exists in therapy. This is actually quite common, where if your work is just performing something, doing something without specific practice, there's a good chance that your confidence will increase, but your ability may stay the same over time. But the good news is that in medicine and music and athletics, in a number of fields, the science of expertise, the science of deliberate practice, what makes people experts in their field, has created some insight into how our field can adapt these emerging ideas about expertise to make our field more effective. And to see this in action, the graph on the bottom here, it has a slight upward slope. So it's almost imperceptible, much like the graph above it is an almost imperceptible downward slope. But this was the first study done, another longitudinal study, assessing whether trainees engaging in deliberate practice would have the same kinds of outcomes as their peers over time. And what this showed was that outcomes actually improved slightly, but it's the first study, a longitudinal study, to actually measure anything that has demonstrated therapist outcomes improving over time. So it's a small piece of data, but it's an important one. In terms of what are we actually talking about? What is the nuts and bolts of deliberate practice? It's an idea about how to practice, not so much what to practice. So deliberate practice isn't, you're going to focus on having better empathy skills, and that's it. Deliberate practice is a way of practicing so that in the long run, every individual can identify what are your specific areas of growth. What do you want to get better at as a therapist? What do your clients give you feedback on that you can improve on? What are you hearing from your supervisor? And you systematically practice and rehearse. So you observe your work, either recording it and watching it with client consent, of course, or having a supervisor observe, or potentially practicing role-playing in supervision or in class, and then getting feedback from somebody who has a specific knowledge about what you're working on, directly related to what it is that you can identify to work on to get better. So those are the small learning goals. The behavioral rehearsal is what you're doing to improve. And then assessing performance is actually measuring your outcomes with clients, having them assess their own sense of whether it's a depression scale, an anxiety scale, something more comprehensive like the OQ45, but finding some way to measure your outcomes so that over time you can see, are your efforts to trying to improve your skills actually leading toward better client outcomes. And then two really important footnotes about this idea of deliberate practice. Number one is it has to be tailored to the individual skill level of the person who's practicing. Since we all have different things that we excel at as therapists, we're all, there's like an infinite number of specific skills, like on a continuum in terms of how good you are at them. And if you're practicing outside of your level of ability, if it's too difficult or even if it's too easy, you likely won't improve. Much like if you go to the gym or you go for a long run and you go beyond what your body can handle, it's not actually going to lead to something productive. It might actually hurt you. And then the other part is that deliberate practice is not saying we're going to make you better at creating therapeutic alliances with your client, because that's too general. It's hard to distill that down into one specific skill to practice. So you may practice a dozen skills related to building a therapeutic alliance. Like, let's say in the intake, in your first session, there's that moment when a client might ask you about yourself, or you might want to share something about yourself to help build rapport, to make them feel like they can trust you, like there's some similarities, or that you have a certain kind of knowledge that can support them. And I think that can be difficult for a lot of therapists because a lot of us don't like talking about ourselves. And so this could be a skill that you rehearse. You practice repeatedly going over what it is you say, how you respond to specific questions about yourself, so that if and when it comes up in a future session, it almost feels like something that's second nature at that point. And so, as I mentioned, this is something that's been tested and researched over the last 30 years or so in a lot of different fields, in chess, in piloting, so people working in flight simulators and having that reviewed by superiors, in medicine and surgery. A lot of research has been done on this in music and athletics. And you can see this graph showing that if you are a violinist, and presumably this applies to a lot of other instruments as well, really the more you practice, the better you get. And a key part of this is that performance is not the same thing as deliberate practice. So let's say you're learning to play basketball and you have a game. The game is doing a little bit of everything. That's where all the skills come together to perform. Deliberate practice is maybe taking something like working on your footwork, working on your jump shot, your release point, whatever it is that basketball players need to work on. and having a coach who can point out exactly what it is that you need to work on to get better. And then you practice that dozens, if not hundreds of times, so that in the game, it just sort of happens on its own. And you don't have to think through it. It's just a part of how you play basketball. And the same thing can be applied to therapy in a lot of ways. But importantly, as I mentioned, we're staying in what's called the zone of proximal development, which is a term that you may have heard. And the idea is if it's too easy, you're not going to get better at it. You're not going to grow. You're not going to strengthen that muscle, so to speak, because it's something that doesn't really take a lot of effort. And on the flip side, if it's too hard, you may just overly tax yourself and it may be difficult to grow. But in between those two areas is what's called the zone of proximal development, where with support, with help from a coach or a peer or somebody else, you can actually strengthen that muscle. It may feel difficult, it may be taxing, but it's something that helps you grow the ability to perform whatever skill it is. I am actually in the process of attempting to learn Spanish. I've been doing this for 4 months now, and I found a coach who's actually training me using these deliberate practice methods. And it is very hard. It's rewarding. It is frustrating. I've never learned another language, and I have a newfound tremendous respect for people who are bilingual or speak multiple languages. But something that my coach shared with me is this idea that if you memorize something, you're borrowing it. And I'm sure we all know what that's like to cram for an exam, to memorize something, and then a year later you realize, I don't remember anything about this. But if you practice it, if you go over something repeatedly until it's internalized, you own it then. It's a part of you. And then it can show up when necessary in practice for us with clients. And so the research on deliberate practice in our field has been growing and growing over the last 6 years or so. And this is just a sample. If anybody's interested, I'll share the resources on where to find these later on. But the research base is growing. And I think it's important to note that there are so many examples in the history of our field of people saying, here's the next big thing. This is going to make therapy more effective. This is going to be the thing that helps clients in the future. This is what we all need to do. And I think there's about 4 decades of outcome research that suggests that as a field, we are just as effective as we were in the 70s, which again is another one of those humbling things. So with a huge dose of humility, I'm happy to report that the initial takeaways from the research is that this does lead to better observer-related skills, including how to follow up. But there is still a lot of research that remains to be done over time to test to make sure that this is what we hope it is, which is a new way of training and studying to be a therapist that leads to better outcomes, that leads to better skills. Deliberate practice is, in my opinion, quite clearly more effective than the traditional, I'm going to tell you how to do therapy, you go do it, and then report back to me how it went approach of teaching and supervision. But that is, of course, the status quo in our field. And an important part of all of this is that having a supportive environment for deliberate practice is really a requirement, because it does take time, it does take effort. It can be difficult because you're working in that zone of proximal development that is mentally and at times physically taxing. So feeling like you have a sense of support, that you're not just doing this in addition to the other 60 hours a week of things you have to do, because that is admittedly quite unsustainable as a regular practice. Oh, great. So at the end of, I think I have one more slide after this. And after the slides, if there's any burning questions, I'll take those. But I'd like to save the questions for after what we're going to do, which is if anybody wants to volunteer, I welcome it. And what I'll do is take maybe 10 minutes and guide you through what a longer deliberate practice exercise looks like. And it may not be easy, and it may not be fun. I completely understand if nobody wants to do it, in which case Alex has volunteered to be my guinea pig. But what this looks like, and this is one version of many of what deliberate practice can look like, is it's maybe a 15-page exercise, the majority of which are client statements. They are prompts for the therapist to improvise based on the skill criteria. And so you can see here, this is for the empathic understanding skill. There's a short introduction to what the skill is and why it's important. There's a few very specific skill criteria that whoever is practicing will try and adhere to when they're responding to the client statement. And then this is, I think, my favorite part is there's statements of increasing difficulty. So there's a beginner, an intermediate, and an advanced grouping of statements. And the goal is to make this in that good range that you see on the scale of emojis here, where it's not too easy, it's not too hard, but it's challenging. And with repetition, the statements that you're working on move from good to easy, and then you make them harder. And so you're really like toggling the switch to help the practice stay in that zone of proximal development. And one important footnote before we get to the resources, and then we try a bit of this, is the long-term idea of what deliberate practice is not necessarily, here's one specific exercise, or in the classes at Sentio University, every class has a deliberate practice component. So students might get hundreds of skills that they practice before they graduate. But those are manualized. Those are written out like the pages you see here on your screen. In the long run, what we're trying to do is create a culture shift where if you either on your own, working with a supervisor, getting feedback from clients, if you identify a specific thing that you recognize you could grow at, there's room for growth, there's room for increasing your skill, that you don't need a formalized structured manual or anything like that. You can say, for example, maybe you struggle with ending sessions on time. That's something that I struggle with, where if a client is like really in it, maybe they bring up something with 2 minutes left that is really hard to stop and say, we can't get into that now. I have some clients who just talk uninterrupted, and it's hard to cut them off in a way that feels supportive and kind of pivots to a, I'll see you next week kind of thing. That's something that you could practice without these kind of formal exercises, where you could rehearse with a friend. You could have them be that person, role play a client who's kind of rambling on or discloses something that's really important, and you have to find a way to empathically say, thank you for sharing that. I'm recognizing that we have to end. So let's move towards saying goodbye for this week, and just keep practicing until when you're in session with clients, it starts to show up as, oh, this feels kind of easy now. I can do this without really struggling through it. And so before we jump to more practice, if these ideas are interesting to you, I always welcome questions and interaction about this. I love talking about it. So feel free to shoot me an email. We also have a website that is the placeholder for our university website, which we cannot legally activate yet, where we have a lot of exercises, resources. If you enjoyed watching that video prompt and responding, there's a ton of those. We just started our social media pages, and a few of my colleagues are in the process of releasing a series of books with the APA. I think 2 of them are out, and there's another dozen or so in the pipeline that will be coming out in the next year. And these are taking the principles of deliberate practice and applying them to some of the most popular modalities of therapy. So CBT, emotion-focused therapy, motivational interviewing, et cetera, where the whole book is from start to finish, here are the core skills to practice to get better at doing these approaches to therapy. And then on the other side of the screen, you have these standard guidelines, and they reflect a lot of what I've been talking about here, that it takes a good bit of time and you want very specific goals. So not get better at having therapeutic alliances with my clients, but get better at this one specific aspect of the therapeutic alliance and then move on to the next part. Constantly assessing and adjusting difficulty to stay in that zone of proximal development. And if you do this, what you find is that maybe after like 30 or 45 minutes, you really start to wear down and you start making a lot more mistakes, because it is taxing, but that's also a sign that there's growth taking place. Repetition is important, to just practice and practice and practice, even one specific client statement, one specific skill, until you feel like you have it. And then if possible, and I know this is at times unrealistic given how busy I think we all are, but if there's a way to schedule time to actually get feedback from a coach, from somebody who has some level of expertise related to the skills that you're working on, that can be an invaluable way to identify what specifically you can best use to practice, what skills they are, and what within those skills are kind of your areas for growth. And so that concludes the end of the slides. And before I ask if there's any volunteers or bring Alex on as my guinea pig, let me switch this over. And I'm curious, are there any burning questions that people have before we do a little bit of practice ourselves? And I will happily take that to mean that I explained everything so clearly. There's no questions at all. It's like you guys have been doing this with me from the start. So is anybody interested in actually volunteering to try this? And if not, no worries. Alex, I think you're on the hot seat.
Next person up. Yep. Okay.
All right, so let me share the exercise here. And just readjust my screen real quick. Great. And so what this looks like in action when you're working with one of these pre-written exercises is the brief skill description explains why this is important and what to focus on. The skill criteria really zeroes in on what the person practicing is meant to be focused on. This is what you want to do when you're improvising a response to the client statement. Then there's always some sample exercises to help it all make more sense. And then we get into it with the first of the statements. So I'll just take a moment and read through some of this real quick. So empathic understanding is a technique that can be integrated into nearly all therapeutic modalities. In person-centered therapy, this skill is one of 3 conditions identified as central to therapeutic success, along with unconditional positive regard and therapist congruence. Unlike most theoretical orientations, person-centered therapy is non-directive, meaning change is presumed to happen through client self-discovery, rather than the therapist providing expert knowledge. Empathic understanding is done by making a statement, not a question, that sensitively and accurately conveys the intensity of the client's experience. This technique is not done by simply repeating the client's words, but instead using empathy to first understand what the client is going through, and then reflecting it back in different language. The goal of empathic understanding is to demonstrate to the client that their internal experience is clearly understood. This helps the client to process their experience and continue moving towards self-acceptance and growth. And so for this specific skill, the most important parts, number 1 is to make a statement that reflects back the client's underlying internal experience in different language. And then number 2 is to use a tone that is tentative and exploratory. And so you can see this in these 3 examples. So in the first example, the client statement is, you know, when my cat died, it really hurt. Like I lost a little piece of myself. I think I still need to deal with these feelings. So there's many responses that meet these 2 skill criteria, but a good example of it would be, you've lost something that meant a lot to you, and it's important to let yourself grieve. And so in this, you can hear how it's conveying back an understanding of the client's experience. And hopefully I did it in a tone that was more tentative and exploratory than like definitive or even asking a question. So there's a couple other examples here. If you're curious, you can look them over and see the same process in action. And so I will be the supervisor, as it were, giving feedback to Alex as he responds to a series of client statements trying to meet these skill criteria. And I can also be the person who reads the client statements. But if anybody wants to test out their acting chops, all you're doing is reading these statements with a little bit of an emotional cue. I just want to leave that option in case somebody feels like they want to challenge Alex a bit for emotional content. If not, I'll just do it myself.
I've played this role before as the thespian here. So if I would encourage somebody, if you want to, this would be a time to step up to you just be reading the prompt that's on the screen. You don't have to improvise anything.
I'm happy to do it. And at any point, if anybody wants to jump in and take over for either Alex or I, will be doing this for about 10 minutes, and then we'll switch to a Q&A if there's any questions. All right, Alex, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. You know, when my cat died, it really hurt. Like I lost a little piece of myself. I think I still need to deal with these feelings.
You're feeling a sense of loss and you're wanting to process that.
Yeah, that was great. It was clear and concise. The first skill criteria, you use different language. You talked about loss, you talked about processing, which is the same exact thing as what I had said, but you're sort of putting your own spin on it and communicating in a way that's a statement, not a question, that you understand my experience. And you did so with a tone that kind of left room if I wanted to disagree. So there was that like tentativeness. So good job. So we'll move on to the next one.
As long as I'm batting 1,000, can I just step out now?
The point of deliberate practice is to bat like 200.
That's
Because this is
a
hard.
great way of putting it.
It is really, really hard.
Yep.
If you're batting 1,000, it means we're going to skip over to the advanced statements and really mess with you.
Yes.
Okay, so number 2. The last few days have felt different. Like that mental fog in my head is finally lifted and I can start making some changes.
There's a sense that you have that things can be different and you're ready to take some steps to try to make that happen.
Yeah, that was really good. The only one specific bit of feedback I'm giving you, and I don't think it's a huge deal, is you repeated the word different. And I think that, so it wasn't so much like a big error that would make the client think you're just parroting them. But I'll invite you to try it again and try and find your own language for your response.
Yep.
So the last few days have felt different. Like that mental fog in my head is finally lifted and I could start making some changes.
You're in a different headspace than you were a few days ago. And then you've been for a long time now. And it seems like that you're ready to maybe take a different path forward.
So that's
Recognize there, I said multiple words.
What? Everything else is great. You're using the right tone. You're reflecting back what the client's experience is. And again, this isn't like a huge error, but since you're my guinea pig, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire a bit and have you do it again. This time, really try and be conscious of finding your own language, so to make sure the client doesn't feel like you're just repeating back what you're hearing. So the last few days have felt different. Like that mental fog in my head is finally lifted and I can start making some changes.
It seems to you like you're having the sense that things were not what they once were, and that you can try out some new ways of going about things that may be better for you.
Perfect. Exactly. Yeah, you found your own language. You conveyed exactly what that underlying internal experience is, and you even reflected back the part of making changes. So really good job. So moving on to statement 3. There's so much piling up. I'm worried I won't be able to handle it all. It's just all too much.
There's a sense that you're getting covered, like there's leaves falling from trees that are just kind of, that you're getting buried underneath, and it's overwhelming.
Yep, that was great. Again, same thing where the tone wasn't expressing certainty. You weren't asking a question or leading them. You're just reflecting back what they said. So that's that first and second part, the tentativeness, and also really communicating that you understand their internal experience. And I want to add, you're doing a really good job of not moving the conversation forward in a sense. You're just staying with the client's experience and letting them know that you understand them, because that's all we're trying to do here for the empathic understanding skill. Okay. The cable guy was supposed to come today, but he never showed up. I waited for 3 hours. It's ridiculous.
You're frustrated when somebody's giving you that kind of commitment and then they don't follow through on it.
Yep, perfect. Met those skill criteria. So client statement number 5. I'm nervous as hell. I think I'm going to hear back about that promotion later today.
It's that waiting time before you know something's coming and it hasn't come yet, but you can feel it coming, and it sounds like that's been very anxiety provoking.
Yep. Again, really good job meeting those skill criteria. And so what happens here using this format that we use for these exercises is, because this can be difficult. This can be really challenging. And so we want to stop and assess, because if it's too easy, we move on to the next set of statements. If it's too difficult, we can start back over at number 1. And so what we do here is we scroll down to this reaction form here, making good use of emojis. So Alex, do me a favor and just look at this scale here from 0 to 10 with the question in mind: how challenging was it to fulfill the skill criteria for all 5 of those statements? And when you have it, let us all know from 0 to 10 how you felt like that was.
I'd say it was a 6 or a 7.
Okay. So in that instance, it's appropriately challenging. And what we would do is have you start back over at number 1 so that you keep practicing them until it feels like it's too easy. And that's when the skill really becomes internalized. And something else I'll have you do And this is only for your own benefit. So I actually don't want you to share your answer, share what you're observing, but just take a moment and answer for yourself. Did you have any reactions in either the good challenge or too hard challenge in those yellow and red boxes there? Question number 2, because I want you to become more familiar with what is it like for you when you're actually in that good zone, so you know what that internal experience is like. And again, don't share it. Just let me know whenever you've thought that through.
Those are very helpful. And yes, I absolutely know some things.
Wonderful. And thank you for your supportive response. So we'll pause there, and to give you all a sense of what this looks like in a more prolonged set of deliberate practice work is, so there's 5 intermediate statements that get a bit harder, and then assess again, 5 advanced statements. And as they get harder, the topics become a bit more challenging, maybe a bit activating. Some of the statements often will try and pull you into a different type of framework. So I think the most common feedback I give when working with people is, that's a great response, but it's not the skill we're looking for. So I'll have you try this again, but focus really on the skill criteria here. Because so often we get pulled into thinking in maybe CBT terms or psychodynamic terms or trauma-informed terms, or whatever it is that you tend to approach clients with. This is a way of strengthening other skills and recognizing that you may just fall into default ways of being. And if you can recognize that a client may benefit from something else, this gives you more skills in your toolbox, as it were. And if as you go, it feels like you're stumped or something doesn't quite make sense, we have these sample responses at the bottom, which are just one of many, many ways to respond in accordance with the skill criteria. So with about 10 minutes left now, let me stop my screen sharing and just check in to see either, are there any questions, but also general feedback or thoughts, anything that you may be thinking of as you observe the practice, but also the whole thing.
I think, hi, sorry, I don't have my camera on, but I'm here. I just think it was super interesting and really cool. I had a question about how you envision, I know you said the goal would be eventually integrating it into training. How do you see that being integrated, like in the meantime? Because I know typically time constraints are hard for supervision. So how often would you want deliberate practice be coming up? Is it when you identify an area, or what does that look like for you, or what do you envision?
So I think this is the single greatest challenge that those of us who are advocates for deliberate practice face, which is nobody on this call has a lot of free time. I've only met most of you for the first time, but I know that that's probably true. And there are a lot of a lot of requirements in supervision, even if you're licensed. We have chosen a profession that often takes a lot of time out of our day. And so it really is a challenge to do deliberate practice in a way that leads to long-term skill development when there really isn't time in the day to fit it in. It is something that requires ongoing practice. And so what I would suggest is, if you feel like there's space in the current framework of supervision that you're in, or if you feel like you have colleagues that you meet with to discuss cases or anything along those lines, if there's a way to carve out, say, 15 to 20 minutes each time, or even 10 to 15 minutes, and say, we're going to make sure we do this no matter what, because it is so easy to find reasons not to do it, because it's not always fun. It's actually hard work. And so saying, all right, the first or the last 10 minutes of supervision, we're going to identify what are the specific skills to work on, and we're going to practice them. But it is challenging, and part of that challenge is why we've made the decision to essentially build our own university. It's a standalone master's level MFT program from the ground up, is to create this supportive scaffolding where it's not something you have to do in addition to everything else. It kind of is the everything else. And we'll report back in 5 to 10 years to see if we've run studies that have successfully demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach. But for now, it really is, if you can find time to fit it in, that's great. If you feel like it's just going to burn you out faster, honestly, don't do it, because it's not worth it. It isn't a magic bullet. It's something that takes a really good bit of like committed, motivated effort. And a lot of us don't have that time.
Thanks. It's really cool. I really liked seeing it in action too. Thanks, Alex, for being the guinea pig.
So Alex, I don't know if there's any other questions. If not, I'd be really curious to hear what your experience was like. Because I know when people try this for the first time, it feels very different. So I'm wondering, what was it like for you to be led through just a short bit of that exercise?
Yeah, exactly what you said, that it was much different than I anticipated. And this is even with observing Dr. Calkin Smith doing some of this, that it was still, and it was saying things out loud, or like whatever. I thought it was going to be that it'd be somewhere like it'd be quite easy. And then maybe if it got too hard, it'd just be obviously too hard. And I was not anticipating it being kind of in that challenge range consistently. And I noticed that the thing with like not repeating the same word, at first when you had said that, I kind of took it as like, well, just like when you're a good writer, you don't want to use the same word too many times. But then I realized, oh no, like it actually forces me to have to think more than if I can just rely on saying the same word. And so it like probably be more attuned to what my client is actually expressing versus kind of autopiloting on just I'm repeating back to them using most of the same words. And that was hard. And it felt like challenging. And I was like, yeah, good. But yeah, I mean, those signs of like good challenge, too much challenge. I had some subjective thoughts of like, yeah, this is good. Okay. Yeah. And also thoughts of like just a bodily brain sensation of like fatigue, like, oh, wow, this is hard after even 6 questions. And you said, we're going to do it again. I'm like, oh, my. So, it was, that was very interesting. And I could definitely see though, yeah, all parts of it were very interesting and just different than even what I anticipated when I volunteered. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. And
Yeah.
anytime you want to be put through the ringer, let me know. We can do it.
Well, so I had a question then as well. So in terms of like the coach's role here, right? How does the coach know what is fitting those parameters or not? Is it purely kind of a subjective sense of it? Is this deliberate practice all the way down? So are the coaches getting deliberate practice on what's a good response and what's not, or is it something else entirely?
Yeah, it's a great question because I'm not sure there's much in our field that is objectively correct. So my interpretation of what a good answer is that is empathic may be different than somebody else's. And this is especially true, cross-culturally. We're not trying to operationalize one specific way of doing correct therapy. I created these exercises. I come from a specific background. I don't think it's helpful if people are doing these exercises and learning how to do therapy and then working with different populations who experience empathy in a different way. So there's always room for subjectivity and there's always room for discussion about it. But what the coach's role is to keep the practice going, because there's so many ways that it can get led off track, like talking theoretically, storytelling, talking a lot about your internal experience. But the only way to truly build skill is to keep practicing and practicing and practicing. And then at the end of every class, at the end of every work with a student, is space to say, what was your experience of this like? And if there's feedback that we get from anybody, it's a very egalitarian process, even though somebody is serving in a coach's role. If there's feedback we get from anybody that says, I don't think this really works in the way you want it to, we just go back and keep modifying it because these are all evolving documents and ways of thinking. It's not like we've figured out how to do therapy right. We've just figured out that there's a way to practice skills, and what those specific skills are endlessly evolving as our field evolves, as culture evolves, and as we realize things that we've done wrong in creating this whole framework of thinking.
That's I want to leave time for students to have questions, but that's a great point. And I didn't even consider that what you said about the coach's role to keep it on point versus like giving the person like, oh, like if I'd started like processing with you about kind of meta thoughts about the whole thing in the middle of practice, that diverts entirely then from the practice. We don't have time to actually do the practice. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alex kind of already hinted at this, I think, but I'm wondering if there's ever a risk of like becoming robotic with it, or becoming like where it's almost too second nature, where that you're not really actually attuning to the clients, or if that's actually not a risk at all with deliberate practice.
I think it is a very real risk. And I'd love to say that doesn't happen and that we all just have that natural intuitive sense of staying present and being highly attuned. But this is something that has to be observed and borne out in the research over time. And so, the initial findings are encouraging that this does actually lead to improved client rated outcomes. But what you're saying is a very real concern that is important to keep, not even in the back of our minds, but in the front of our minds as we do this, as we integrate this into the field, because creating therapy robots is not going to help. But I can't say with certainty that that isn't the concern that we've figured out how to avoid yet. It's just a matter of collecting data, being humble, and if it is happening, figure out how to navigate through that concern.
I wonder on that front too, Ben, at least hypothetically, the idea that, as you've talked about, that deliberate practice be used for all kinds of therapy skills, right? Common factor skills, but then also skills to particular modalities, that may help prevent the message from coming across like therapists must always reflect no matter what. Which would be more the kind of the robotic experience for a client.
Right, and I think that's one of the important parts of, as this idea of deliberate practice evolves, is not just here's the stuff you practice, now you're a great therapist. It's here's a way to practice. As you go, identify what are those things within yourself that you feel like you can improve on to be a better therapist, and practice those. So it's not so formulaic and we're creating therapy robots, but we're showing people that there's a different way of developing skills that you can then plug in your own areas of growth into, and ideally improve those skills over time and get better results with your clients.
Sorry, I know we're like almost, if not out of time, but I just had a quick question. Can you use deliberate practice for like when you should use certain skills, or how does like that part go along with it?
So I don't think that there's a specific way to instruct people on when to use certain skills. And I think that's like the saying is therapy is an art and a science. I think that's the art part of it. That's why, like therapy chatbots serve some purpose, but they're never going to fully replace us, because there is that human element. There is that empathic moment when you're with another person and you feel attuned, the interpersonal neurobiology that allows you to move towards healing. And I think in that is the kind of intuition of, okay, right now my client doesn't need me to suggest anything or ask a question, but just to communicate empathy, as one of a million examples. And if you can feel that in the moment, almost subconsciously, you already have practiced this specific skill. So it comes out in a way that is as supportive as possible for your client. But in terms of knowing when to deploy the skill of empathy versus, something like challenging a cognitive distortion, I don't think that can ever be fully taught. And I think that's the beautiful part of therapy, is that it can't be fully taught. It has to just happen, and everybody finds their own space between themselves and every individual client where they know on like a deeper level, this is what may be most helpful in this moment.
All right, well, Ben, thank you again so much for joining us and speaking to our team. This was wonderful.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you all so much. Enjoy your weekend.